Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 28 November 2024. It is the 202nd anniversary of the birth of Nikolay Yakovlevich Danilevsky, who was born in the village of Oberets on this date in 1822. Danilevsky's name has been translated from the Cyrillic in different ways, so there are alternative spellings and pronunciation. Danilevsky was born into a Russian noble family, and the family estate at Mashanka was not all that far from Tolstoy's family estate at Yasna Polyana. He was an elder contemporary of Tolstoy, and he was also a contemporary of Henry Thomas Buckle, Wilhelm Dilthey, James Fitzjames Stephen, Francis Parkman, Ferdinand Gregorovius, and others that I have profiled, all born in the 1820s. Most interestingly, perhaps, Danilevsky was a contemporary of Dostoevsky. Both Danilevsky and Dostoevsky were involved in the Petrashevsky Circle, which was a progressive literary salon in St. Petersburg that read Western philosophical works when they were banned in Russia. Some members of the Petrashevsky Circle were more radical than the others, calling for terrorism and violent rebellion, and these radicals ended up getting all the members of the Petrashevsky Circle into serious trouble. The circle was broken up in 1849 and its members arrested. Danilevsky spent 100 days in prison in the Peter and Paul Fortress in St. Petersburg, but it went rather worse for Dostoevsky. He was sentenced to death and walked out to meet the firing squad with other former members of the Petrashevsky Circle. At the very last moment, a letter from the Tsar was delivered that commuted their sentences. Dostoevsky describes the experience in his novel The Idiot, though not in the first person, but attributing it to someone else. This gruesome exercise was, in fact, a piece of theater that had been arranged by the authorities to give the members of the Petrashevsky Circle a good scare so they wouldn't cause any more trouble. By all accounts, it worked. Dostoevsky was scared straight, and it was said that some of the men who experienced this were never the same thereafter. Danilevsky didn't go through this mock execution, but I'm sure he realized how close he came to danger. He went on, originally under police surveillance, to hold a number of minor posts and offices, and he eventually died in Tbilisi, having traveled quite extensively throughout the Russian Empire. Danilevsky is seen as part of the second generation of Slavophile and Pan-Slavic philosophers. Slavophiles rejected Peter the Great's campaign of westernization for Russia and sought to delineate a specifically Slav identity and destiny, with Russia at the head of the Slav peoples as its spiritual and political leader. In this sense, we can see him as an intellectual ancestor of Alexander Dugin. He published Russia and Europe, the Slavic world's political and cultural relations with the Germanic Roman West in 1869, and Woe to the Victors, the Russo-Turkish War, the Congress of Berlin, and the Future of Slavdom in 1878. Russia and Europe wasn't translated into English until 2013, and Woe to the Victors was translated into English in 2015. So all throughout the 20th century, there was very little available by or about Danilevsky in English. During the Cold War, a book about Danilevsky appeared by Robert E. McMaster. Danilevsky, a Russian totalitarian philosopher, published in 1967, when Danilevsky had long been out of print in Russia and didn't seem to have any influence at all on official Soviet ideology. Calling Danilevsky a totalitarian seems like rather strong rhetoric for a scholarly book, but we have come to expect such things in the conflict between East and West, and the book, as I said, was written during the Cold War. In between the rhetorical outbursts, and sometimes as part of an outburst, McMaster McMaster comments on Danilevsky's philosophy of history. Quote, there is a whole relatively consistent, finished pan-Slavist and utilitarian philosophy of history on the surface, as it were, of Russia and Europe. The completeness of this philosophy, together with the presence in Danilevsky's work of much more, indeed of things which are utterly contradictory, raises questions about his goals, whether he really wanted a pan-Slav union for the merely political and cultural reasons he stated, or whether he had in mind higher aims, like spiritual fulfillment, the harmonization of man with God, nature, his fellows, and himself, and, if such was the case, why did he not say so more openly? The middle chapters of his book raise such questions particularly cogently, for one has to do very little probing beneath the surface to see that Danilevsky had a deep commitment to spiritual ends, to a theological, metaphysical view of history, and to the Russian traditions he so heartily decried in his typal Pan-Slavist theory, unquote. A review of McMaster by Alfred A. Skirpin, published in 1968, addresses McMaster's effort to cast Danilevsky in the totalitarian role. Quote, McMaster's argument is largely based on what Danilevsky wrote in the last chapters of Russia and Europe, in which he comes closest to playing the role of totalitarian philosopher that McMaster assigns to him. But even in these chapters, it is questionable whether Danilevsky is really the leftist and radical McMaster would like to make of him. Furthermore, Danilevsky is supposed to have remained essentially a totalitarian philosopher throughout the 70s and into the early 80s. Here, McMaster seems to be on especially shaky ground, for he adduces only a few passages from articles Danilevsky wrote during the Russo-Turkish War to illustrate Danilevsky's continued totalitarian tendencies during these years. Unquote. McMaster also wrote a 1954 paper on Danilevsky, so more than a decade before his book, Danilevsky and Spengler, in which McMaster compares the two. Quote, critics and admirers alike address themselves almost exclusively to the theory of cultural historical types, to what they regarded as Danilevsky's denial of the possibility of human progress, and to the sociological implications of his theories. Today, the chief component of his historical reputation is that he was a forerunner of Oswald Spengler. The present discussion is no exception, for it is the purpose here to examine critically the latter view, now undoubtedly the most important and persistent line of interpretation of Danilevsky's philosophy of history, unquote. In noting that Danilevsky is seen as a forerunner of Spengler, McMaster was on firmer ground than when he profiled Danilevsky as a totalitarian philosopher. But it's entirely possible that Danilevsky's Slavophile and Pan-Slavic philosophy sounded totalitarian for Westerners who looked at the Soviet bloc as a monumental threat to the Western world and its way of life. So some of this may be due to the lens with which McMaster viewed Danilevsky and Danilevsky's place in Russian culture. Danilevsky's book, Russia and Europe, is remarkable, I think, and it compares Russian civilization to the civilizations of the West, while part of the purpose of the book is to discuss Slav identity and destiny in such a way as to provide an aspiration for Slavic peoples. Another part of the book is more analytical and more philosophical, and it's well worth reading. The impact of the book isn't yet fully felt in the Western world. Like I said, it was only translated in 2013. And, it's a legitimate question to ask whether Danilevsky's arguments could ever get a hearing in the Western world. Russia and Europe is perhaps best known for Danilevsky's schematism of cultural historical type, which I mentioned earlier, McMaster referenced. And they resemble in some ways the familiar lists of civilizations that we find in Spengler, Toynbee, and others. Danilevsky identified 10 cultural historical types. Quote, these cultural historical types or distinct civilizations ranked in chronological order are the following. 1, Egyptian, 2, Chinese, 3, Assyrian, Babylonian, Phoenician, Chaldean, or ancient Semite, 4, Indian, 5, Iranian, 6, Jewish, 7, Greek, 8, Roman, 9, Neo-Semitic or Arab, 10, Germanic, Roman, or European. To those can be added perhaps 2 American types, the Mexican and the Peruvian, which died a violent death and did not manage to complete their development, unquote. It's interesting that Danilevsky merges together Assyrian, Babylonian, Phoenician, which all have hyphens between them, and then after a comma, Chaldean, and then or ancient Semite. All of these are smashed together in his third cultural historical type, as though he couldn't decide if they were one or many. And this short foreshadows many similarly awkward hyphenations that we find in Toynbee and in the more familiar ideas of Greco-Roman or Judeo-Christian, whatever those terms are supposed to mean. These kinds of confusions could easily be cleared up if we approached history in a more detailed way. But when someone comes up with a list of cultural historical types or a list of civilizations or whatever, it seems to lose its potency if the list grows too long. So you could say that there is an implicit concision requirement that governs any such taxonomy. Toynbee's list is longer than most, at 23 civilizations, but even this represents a lot of compromises. And in fact, Toynbee is always equivocating in his own book of how long his list of civilizations is. Danilevsky also propounded laws for the development of these cultural historical types. I'm going to quote this in full since it's so interesting. Quote, Law 1. Any tribe or family of peoples characterized by a separate language or group of languages with similarities that can be readily detected without deep philological investigation constitutes a distinct cultural historical type. If it has already grown out of its infancy and is inclined toward and generally capable of historical development. Law 2. For the civilization of a distinct cultural historical type to be born and develop, the peoples belonging to it must have political independence. Law 3. The principles of civilization for one cultural historical type are not transferable to the peoples of another type. Each type produces its own, influenced more or less by foreign civilizations preceding or contemporary with it. Law 4. The civilization of each cultural historical type only attains fullness, diversity, and richness when its diverse ethnographic elements, independent but not combined into a political whole, form a federation or political system of states. Law 5. The course of development for cultural historical types closely resembles that of perennial plants that bear fruit only once, whose period of growth is indefinitely long, but whose period of flowering and bearing fruit is relatively short and exhausts its vitality once and for all, unquote. Much of the book is taken up with characterizing the nature of Western civilization, especially as it appears vis-a-vis Slavic civilization, and looking forward to what Slavic civilization has yet to be. But note that Danilevsky doesn't have a specific cultural historical type for Western civilization, but what he identified with another hyphenation, the Germanic, Roman, or European. In some historical contexts, the Germanic and Roman are seen as antitheses, especially since the Germanic tribes invaded the Roman Empire and hastened its destruction. And in these contexts, we wouldn't think of introducing a hyphenated Germanic-Roman cultural historical entity, but there's also a sense in which the resulting fusion following the Gothic invasions does represent something like a Germanic Roman cultural type. And it was this that was the ultimate basis of Western civilization. And it seems to be this that was the basis of Danilevsky's conception of Western civilization. As a strongly ethnocentric work that outlines Danilevsky's aspirations for Russia, I can understand why some, like McMaster, have reacted strongly against Danilevsky's Russia in Europe. But I found the book not only valuable, but something that can be taken up and built upon and not merely relegated to being an historical curiosity. And I myself tried to build upon Danilevsky's work. As I cited Danilevsky in my paper, The Devil's Engines, Technological Textures of Life on Earth and in Space, essentially in relation to what could be called Danilevsky's implicit philosophy of technology. Danilevsky explicitly argues that science will be different among different cultural historical types due primarily to three factors. Quote, the preference shown by different peoples for different branches of knowledge. 2, the natural one-sidedness of each people's distinctive abilities and worldview that cause it to see reality from a unique point of view. 3, a certain admixture of objective truth with individual subjective peculiarities that, like all other moral qualities and traits, are not randomly distributed among peoples, but grouped by nationality and, taken collectively, constitute what we would call the national character, unquote. I haven't found anything like this argument in any other philosopher, although I could say that it was implicit in Spengler's incommensurable civilizations, each of which have their own distinctive and incommensurable forms of knowledge. In an ideal science, a science that was complete and exhaustive, this might not be true, but we don't even know if such an ideal science is possible. If the ideal scope of science includes mathematics, we have demonstrable proof that mathematics can't be complete, which would include the possibility of an exhaustive, which would exclude the possibility of an exhaustively complete science that would exclude the possible cultural historical varieties of science for which Danilevsky argues. In my recent episode on Henry Thomas Buckle, I talked about how there is no science of science, meaning that while individual sciences are scientific, the scientific enterprise on the whole is not. A consequence of the absence of a science of science is the selective way in which science develop. And this in turn leads to Danilevsky's philosophy of science, which acknowledges that science can be different in different social milieu. In other words, science is relative to the scientific community that practices science. Thomas Kuhn comes close to an analogous conclusion, though for Kuhn it is the diachronic relativity of science that emerges from a history of scientific revolutions triggered by model crises and paradigm shifts. Kuhn's work continues to be debated, and there are significant differences of interpretation that keep alive the controversy as to whether paradigm shifts are essentially rational or essentially irrational. Danilevsky, on the other hand, presents us with the prospect of the synchronic relativity of science in contradistinction to Kuhn's diachronic relativity of science. So for Danilevsky, paradigms differ not down through historical time, but across ethnic communities. This strikes at the heart of Enlightenment universalism, but as I have argued many times, Enlightenment ideology is not intrinsically scientific. For a time, Enlightenment thinkers made common cause with the sciences as a way both to advance their interests and to fight the common enemy of traditionalism. But scientists themselves have so completely internalized Enlightenment ideology that even if the Enlightenment can abandon science, scientists cannot abandon Enlightenment, at least at the present time. The idea that science is the same, that it must be the same for all who practice it, seems to be an unspoken presupposition of science practiced subspicie illuminatatis, that is to say, under the Enlightenment paradigm. I don't know of any analytical philosophers who've taken up Danilevsky's argument, even if ordered to refute it. Nor do I know of any analogous arguments, though my knowledge of contemporary philosophy of science is far from exhaustive, though I've cited what parallels I can find in Thomas Kuhn. So the closest I've come to find in Danilevsky of analogy to Danilevsky in mainstream Anglo-American analytical thought is Thomas Kuhn's philosophy of science. And this, you could say, evades some of the most troubling aspects of Danilevsky's account. But in the absence of a science of science, we can't definitively exclude Danilevsky's account, just as we can't exclude the role of personalities in the development of science, nor can we exclude the possibility of alternative sciences that explain as much of the world as our familiar sciences, but which are largely disjoint from the familiar sciences. The latter possibility is related as an anecdote in Eugène Wigner's paper, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. Wigner wrote, quote, "Someone came to me and expressed his bewilderment with the fact that we make a rather narrow selection when choosing the data on which we test our theories. How do we know that if we made a theory which focuses its attention on phenomena we disregard some of the phenomena now commanding our attention, that we could not build another theory which has little in common with the present one, but which nevertheless explains just as many phenomena as the present theory? It has to be admitted that we have no definite evidence that there is no such theory." Unquote. Danilevsky's philosophy of science argues that there are definitely such theories, and that such theories manifest themselves among distinct cultural historical types as the science, or more broadly, the knowledge or the conceptual framework of these different cultural historical types. Again, this point of view is anathema to Enlightenment universalism, but this is why we find the idea in a 19th century Pan-Slavist philosopher not only distant from the Enlightenment, but reacting against the Enlightenment in the form of Peter the Great's Westernization campaign in Russia. In my episode on Karl Popper, I mentioned Popper's argument for historical indeterminism based on the unpredictability of the development of scientific knowledge. If we were to fold Danilevsky's conception of science into this Popperian argument for indeterminism, it skews Popper's argument in interesting ways. On the one hand, different varieties of science point to an ever greater indeterminism in science, since we have additional factors that come into scientific development, namely the cultural factor. On the other hand, that distinctive cultural historical types each possess a distinctive form of science implies a kind of ethnocentric predictability that I expect would have horrified Popper. So happy birthday, Nikolay Danilevsky. Happy Thanksgiving, and thanks for listening.